Alright, so let's go ahead and create a new canvas. You can go to File, New, or you can click on the New shortcut. And the canvas size I'm going to use today is 36 by 48 inches at 150 dpi. This is a pretty big size canvas, so if you wanted to, you could print this pretty large, or you could scale it down if it's too big for you. The reason why I'm choosing 150 for the resolution and not 300 is because if I scale this resolution up to 300, it's going to be a huge file and Painter's going to perform very, very slowly. So cutting the resolution down helps to kind of speed things up. Plus, when you're looking at a really big piece, you're not going to be looking at it up close, so you really don't need the resolution to be very high. So let's go ahead and click on OK. And now we have our canvas that we can paint on. So let's go ahead and just pick a base color. Let's say we want something maybe like this, a gray color. I'm going to go ahead and go to Fill. That's found under the Edit menu as well. That's going to be my base color. And I'm just going to paint a few rectangles here. So the first rectangle I make, I'm going to create using the rectangular selection tool. And I'm going to make it right about like this. So we're going to leave a little strip down on the bottom for one color. And then the two remaining rectangles here, we're going to divide roughly in half. So that's what this square here is representing. I'm going to create a new layer. And let's say that our next color is going to be kind of an orangey red color like this. I'm going to go to Fill, and I'm going to fill that square with that color. I think I want that to be a little bit darker. Let's try that again and see. I think that works. I'm going to deselect the selection with Control D. You could also choose Select None. Let's create a new layer. This will be for our strip on the bottom. I'm going to shift the hue a little bit more towards red. Let's pick a brighter orange red here. Let's use that same rectangular selection tool to go ahead and create a rectangle on the bottom, and we'll fill that with the Fill command. You can also use Control F for the keyboard shortcut. Control D to deselect that selection. And maybe let's make one more layer. Let's put a really dark, almost black strip in there somewhere. That might look kind of cool. Maybe we'll do that dividing these two squares here. So I'm going to go ahead and fill. So when we're thinking about the elements of art, we want to think about a few different things. One is line, and we have these big thick lines here. You could use any kind of line in your work. The second is shape, and these rectangles are shapes. You could also use circles and triangles and any kind of shape that you want. The next element is value, and value is the lightness or darkness of a color. So we have a nice range in value. We have kind of a lighter medium gray, we have a dark gray, we have kind of a medium brown, and we have a nice bright color. So we have a nice range of colors. And these colors are also kind of harmonious to each other. There's an analogous color scheme where we stayed kind of within this orange-red range here. If we wanted a complementary color to this color, we would go right across from it in the color wheel, and we could choose something like this kind of teal blue-green color. And maybe just for the heck of it, let's go ahead and replace this dark gray with that color. I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency, and I'm going to fill. And let's make that a little bit darker, just so there's still some contrast. Contrast is the next important thing. We want there to be a good balance between light and dark colors. If you want, you can rename these layers to whichever color they are if you're going to kind of rearrange this or change the colors. For example, I could move this layer around to a different position, or I could free transform it if I wanted to make it bigger or smaller. But when you're done rearranging your layers, the next thing that we'll do is we will go to drop all layers so that we can just blend all of these colors together. Then I'm going to zoom in here so I can see this edge. And I'm going to choose a blender. Let's try the Coarse Oily Blender 2. I'm going to choose a different paper texture. Let's go with the gessoed canvas. Since this is a pretty large canvas, I'm going to go ahead and turn my paper scale up. I'm going to keep my paper contrast right around 150. And let's do a little test blend here and let's see what we get. Now you should be getting something like this where you get a little bit of texture when you blend. If you're not getting that, you may want to play with the contrast setting to get more or less texture. You're going to get more texture if you put it higher, less texture if you put it lower. I think this is working pretty well. So what I want to do is I want to hit Tab on my keyboard, and I just want to paint right along the edge here so that I don't have such a perfect straight edge. I'm just kind of doing little back and forth zigzags. I'm going to do that on all of these lines here. And that's going to help make this look like it was painted with a paintbrush on the canvas. Let's go ahead and zoom back out and let's see how we're looking. Let's go ahead and add a new layer. Let's turn off preserve transparency so that we can paint on that layer. And let's go ahead and use the chalk brush, and we'll select white, and let's just paint right along some of the edges here, just to give the impression that when we were painting this, we didn't paint all the way to the edge. You don't have to do this everywhere, but maybe just in a couple little spots here. That'll help this look a little more organic, like it's a traditional painting. You could also do that in a couple spots where you've separated two colors. You could imagine maybe you started with a white canvas, and when you were painting the blue against the brown here, you didn't paint all the way to the edge, and so there's a little bit of the white canvas showing through. Let's go back to that coarse oily blender. Let's just blend with that right along that edge. And we'll blend along the edge of the canvas here, like so. Zoom back out and see how we're looking. So we'll continue using that coarse oily blender, but let's change our paper texture and scale a little bit. So I'm going to reduce the scale of the texture, and I'm going to reduce the contrast of the texture to right around 116 and 103. Any number around there is fine. And now if we paint, it's going to smudge quite a bit more, so we're going to get less texture. So what I want to do is I kind of want to just smudge this paint into the shape that I want. And then once we're done with that, we'll go ahead and drop all layers again. And we can kind of smudge and blend some of these layers together a little bit more. Now the white is mixing with the layers underneath. We have a very simple composition as far as the shapes in it, but right now we're going to be adding this fine detail to make it look more organic. And that's what you can appreciate in work like this. If we zoom back out, we can see how we're looking. Let's add another layer, and let's add a little bit of texture and color variation. So what we'll do is we'll select the chalk brush. The chalk works really well to give you nice paper textures. And let's choose our paper texture under organismal paper textures called Polypay Wool. And I'm going to select maybe kind of a darker gray like so. You want to make sure your paper is inverted, and you can set your paper scale and contrast to some different settings to get different results. Let's try this with a big brush and see. We're adding a little bit of texture here. Let's change that composite method to overlay. Let's select a lighter gray. Let's add in some of that. But you can see, since this is set to overlay, it's kind of lightening and darkening some areas. If we change the scale of our paper, we can get some larger fractal shapes. I'm going to keep going back and forth between light and dark. I'm also going to rotate my paper texture. That's going to help vary this texture a little bit. Back to the lighter gray again. Next, let's go ahead and save a copy of our artwork by going to Save As. I'm going to call this Rothko 1. And we're saving because we're going to add a mask to this layer by clicking on the New Layer mask. And occasionally that can crash Painter when you're messing around with masks, so it's always good to save before you do any masking. We're going to select black, and we're going to paint. And that's going to conceal a little bit of that texture. If we uninvert our paper texture, we'll get more of a result here when we mask. So it's just kind of eating away at that texture, making it look less repetitive. Let's turn down the opacity of that layer. Now you can see we have this nice, subtle texture. Let's go ahead and drop all of our layers. That will apply that mask and just merge everything together. And now we can use that coarse oily blender again to go ahead and blend some of this. You could blend in one kind of common direction if you wanted to, and that might kind of help this look like brush strokes. So I'm painting more or less kind of horizontally. It's making this look more streaky. Well, this is that kind of variable texture you'd get if you did really loose, spontaneous, organic painting like this. Paint over the edge a little bit too. That'll kind of help bust it up a little bit. Let's zoom out and see how we're looking. Starting to come together now. Next, we'll want to add a little bit of canvas texture over the top of this. So let's create a new layer. Let's call this texture. And let's select this neutral gray, which is 128 for the value and 0 for the hue and saturation. Let's fill the canvas with that gray. And then let's set the composite method to overlay. That's going to make that particular color of gray invisible, but any other colors we add will still show up. And let's change our paper texture back to this gessoed canvas. And let's go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture. And if we take a look at our texture, we can see that it is a little too big. So I'm going to cancel out of this, and I'm going to scale that down about like so. And I'm going to apply that same surface texture effect again. When you're zoomed out like this, it's still going to look kind of big. So let's go ahead and just click OK and zoom in. And you can see when we zoom in now, we're actually getting that real size of the texture. What's happening here is it's starting to look like a bigger texture because we're getting this moire effect, which is kind of an optical illusion. So if you zoom into 100%, that's the real texture that you're going to get. And you can see that looks a lot like a canvas now. I'm going to zoom back out because we don't want this texture to be completely uniform. If this were on a traditional media canvas, the thicker paint would cover up the canvas more. So we need to create a mask on this layer. And we need to switch our paper texture back to that polypay wool. And let's select black and the chalk brush. And let's paint just all over that canvas in some different places. That's going to conceal that paper texture in some places. And so it's not going to be so uniform. It's going to look way more organic. You can see that kind of helps to break up that moire pattern as well. If I zoom in, you can see that it's not so uniform anymore. It looks way more organic. Now, if you like, you can continue adding paint and blending and adding texture, but you'll want to make sure that you do that on layers that are underneath this texture layer. That way your nice canvas texture will stay on top of everything. And if you like, you can go ahead and right-click on this mask and choose Apply Layer Mask to go ahead and apply it. And then you can save a copy of your artwork by choosing Save As. I'm saving as the PSD format because I like to work between Painter and Photoshop. I'm going to click back on the canvas layer and I'll show you some other blenders that you can try. The Coarse Smear Blender Jitter works really well. It can kind of break up the edges and blend the color together a little bit. So I'll just do that in a few places here and there just to kind of help this look more organic. Let's add a new layer. Let's set that to multiply. Let's select kind of a dirty brownish color like this. Let's select the sponge. We'll make a big sponge. And let's paint in a few places on the canvas here to add a little bit of grime to it. We'll reduce the opacity of that layer. That just gives it a little bit of dirt and texture and helps it look more organic. Alright, I think this is starting to come together. I'm going to add one more layer of texture because sometimes one layer of texture just isn't enough. I'm going to call this texture 2. Let's select that same neutral gray color. Let's fill that layer with that gray color. Let's set the composite method to overlay. And let's select a new paper texture. Let's choose simulated wood grain. I'm going to set my scale and contrast at about the midway point. And we'll choose Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture. I think I want that texture to be a bit bigger, so I'm going to increase the scale quite a bit. And let's apply that again. That looks better to me. I'm going to click on OK. I'm going to add a mask to that layer. I'm going to select black. I'm going to select the polypay wool paper texture. I'm going to make sure it's not inverted, and I'm going to select the chalk brush. And I'm just going to mask away some of that texture, just like I did with the first one. Let's go ahead and zoom in and see how we're looking. Now you can really see what that did. We have some really nice lumpy areas, but they're not going across the whole piece. I'm going to turn down the opacity of that layer just to blend it in a bit more because I don't want it to be so strong. I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and right click on that texture mask and let's choose Apply Layer Mask. Let's choose Save As to save a copy of our work. Let's go ahead and drop all of our layers since we're getting near the end here. And if you want to play around with some different color schemes, you can go to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors, and you can shift the hue. And that looks kind of cool. So with that, I think we have a finished painting in the style of Mark Rothko. And now if we want to print this or put it on the web, we're going to need to save a couple different copies here. So let's go ahead and go to Save As, and let's call this Rothko Print. I'm going to change the format to TIFF because TIFF works really well for printing. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And if we go to Canvas, Resize, let's take a look at this for a second. Now we can print this at a maximum size of 36 by 48, but if you wanted to print this smaller, you could of course scale it down. So for instance, we could choose 12 for the height and 9 for the width. You could also put the resolution back up to 300 if you're scaling it down. And so you can see we scaled it down to 9 by 12 and the resolution still looks really good. You may want to save a copy by doing Save As and then designate this print 9 by 12. That way you still have your original at the full size. You can save that. If we want to put this on the web, we're going to need to make it quite a bit smaller because we don't want to put a huge image on the web. So what we're going to want to do is resize this a bit smaller by going to Resize. And we want to change the resolution to 72 first because that's the resolution for the web. And we can really make this any size we want. Let's look at pixels and let's pick a pixel dimension. Let's say we want it to be 1200 by 1600. We'll click on OK. That'll shrink it down to a web size. We can go to Save As again and we can save this as 1200 by 1600 pixels web. That way we know it's for the web. And let's change the format to PNG. That's the best quality web format. You could also choose JPEG, but that might make your colors a little bit duller and make your image lose some quality. So I always choose PNG for the web. Click on Save. And now if we look in our project folder, you can see we have several versions of this file. We have our original, and then we have a version for printing at full size. We have a version for printing at 9 by 12, smaller, and we have a version for posting to the web. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you did, take a quick second to like this video and share it with your friends. And if you want to see more tutorials like this, go on over to patreon.com and make a donation today to help me continue making videos like this possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.